Welcome, movie fans. Thanks for joining us for this special Star Wars Podcast Day episode of Reading Between the Reels. If you're a new listener, we're so glad you found us. If you've been enjoying the show, please like, follow, and subscribe, and review us on iTunes or Spotify. You can also support the show by posting on your socials and joining our Facebook group. Today on the show, we're giving you a taste of what we do on our show by going back into the archives for one of our early deconstructions. In this episode, we revisit the earlier incarnation of our show, Coruscant Community College, to break down Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
I'm Craig Dickinson.
And I'm Matt Leader. Today on the show, we'll begin a series of in-depth examinations of the Star Wars films with our deconstruction of Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
So just like we did with Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, we're going to be breaking down this movie by focusing on the aspects we covered in Season 1 and sharing our general thoughts on the film and its place in the larger Star Wars canon. And I do want to just give a special thanks to anybody who joined us because you heard about our participation in Star Wars Podcast Day 2021. We're honored to take part and hope that you support all the great podcasts that are involved in that. So we'll go ahead and jump in and talk about what we noticed in cinematography. Matt, you want to lead off with that?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that stood out to me was the use of shadows and lighting in general. And I felt like this was a big improvement over the first two films, Episode 1 and Episode 2. And there's a couple moments that stood out to me in particular. Padme hiding in the shadows when Anakin and Obi-Wan return to Coruscant for the first time is just obviously symbolic of hiding their relationship from the Senate and from the Jedi Council. And then later on when Anakin is in I was about to say throne room, but it's not really a throne room yet. It's in Palpatine's office right after killing Mace Windu. And you see this great shadow over half of Anakin's face. And one half is still lit, one half is dark. And it makes me also think of Kylo in The Force Awakens. And there's some great lighting work done with Kylo on the bridge with Han Solo as well. What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, no, those are great. You know, I love the beginning of this film so much. I knew we talked a little bit about that before we recorded, but just that you have the pair of starfighters. We can tell pretty much right away who that's going to be. And then they're small, which is kind of interesting because usually, the most important thing is the biggest thing, but they do that, just to show you the scale of the battle, which I think is really interesting. And they're kind of just swallowed up by this whole thing. But you have this great sweeping shot, camera work wise, that follows. It's like one unbroken shot from very small all the way up into the cockpit for Anakin. So that's just a really cool. There's a lot of interesting and unique things in this film, cinematography wise, as opposed to some of the other Star Wars movies that Lucas did. I love that they're going through the cockpit, the point of view through the cockpit quite a bit through the battle. Some of the other shots that I really enjoyed with this one is the really extreme wide shot. This is some things that always stuck out to me. The extreme wide shot with Obi-Wan stowing away Padme's ship, where you almost can't see him. And I always enjoy when filmmakers reward you for paying attention. And you're like, oh, look, I think there's something happening there. And that's just a really cool shot. I did notice too, you mentioned about the shadows, and that was a great point. I didn't actually have it on my list, so I'm glad you did. That there seemed to be a lot more like medium or American shots, which it looked like they were focusing on performance a lot more in this one. Like the emotional beats in this story are so important that they want to, even during the action, there's just a lot more focus on body language and facial expressions. And you're like, we've gotten to know these characters, and now it's like they're fully on display. And so I was like, I just got to notice, wow, we've kind of zoomed in quite a bit more, and kind of wondering about the reasons for that. But I just figured, we're really concerned with capturing these performances. Some really cool composition geometrically for me in this one too. I noticed a lot more triangles this time through. I had not watched it for that purpose before, but especially when they go into the observation platform at the beginning, you can see as they enter the room that Palpatine is very much the apex of the triangle. And that the triangle rotates a couple of times where he's not necessarily, but for the most part, he kind of is like the center of what's happening, which I think is really cool. You also see that when Dooku enters the room, that he's at the apex, and it's almost like it's triangular in the way that it's set, where he's up at the top, and then the staircase kind of trickles down on the sides. So some really interesting things to look for if you're looking for geometric stuff there. For me, also, I wanted to talk about color, and my favorite thing is where Anakin has the two lightsabers crossed in front of Dooku. It's very much like, am I in the Jedi path of blue or the Sith path of red? The symbolism there is just really cool. But I think that's all I had for cinematography. Did you have anything else you wanted to mention?
Yeah, so I think in general, this is probably the most adventurous of the three films is in terms of cinematography, especially with the camera work and some of the composition as far as like you're mentioning the American shot. One complaint that I have about episode 2 that I actually forgot to mention was in that final lightsaber fight between Dooku and Anakin. It's probably my least favorite because so much of it is shot so closely to Anakin and Dooku that you can't really see what's going on. And I understand that they want to get some emotion. Like, you don't want the shots all being so far away that you can't see how the characters are reacting. But I think they went overboard with it. And what I noticed with this film, in particular with Anakin and Obi-Wan's fight, even though it's extremely emotional and it's very intense, they do a great job of mixing up the different kinds of shots they use so that you get to see their faces sometimes. You also get to see, their body movements and their surroundings. And so overall, this film is a big step forward for me in terms of cinematography. Just the action of the camera moving around in that first shot of the movie is amazing. I think it's probably, I would say that it's the best opening of any Star Wars movie if you discount the classic factor of A New Hope, right? Because you can't beat classics. They're classics for a reason. But I do think this is probably, in my opinion, probably the best one. I mean, it's so interesting when they come in and it looks like they're just flying in. Like in episode 2, when you have the Naboo shuttle come in and the starfighters, it's just a shot of the starships coming down to Coruscant. That's it. And there's action afterward. But this one, it's, kind of playing with that a little bit, where they come around I don't want to call it the Star Destroyer because I know that's not what it is.
Right.
But they come around that ship and there's just this massive battle in the background. And we never get to see something like that. I don't think in any other Star Wars film, aside from maybe Rise of Skywalker, we get something close to that size.
Yeah, it's a story I've heard about that shot, or that scene, I should say, rather, is that it has everything but the kitchen sink. And so they actually put a kitchen sink in it. Like one of the things, and I think it's on one of the commentaries, where if you look for it, you can see there's this very small piece of debris that goes flying into one of the ships. And like, there's the kitchen sink. Because it literally has everything, right? That they didn't pull. They literally pulled all the stops out on this one. So I also had that for kind of transitioning into sound, that the film starts with the Force theme, but it's a very militaristic Force theme.
Yeah.
Which, is not a good thing. We see in Phantom Menace where Qui-Gon says, or actually Qui-Gon says, I can't fight a war for you. And even in Attack of the Clones, Mace Windu says, we're keepers of the peace, not soldiers. And they've fully transitioned into generals. It's interesting to see that juxtaposition between what should be kind of this mystical, peaceful thing into, no, we're full on fighting a war, and in how the Force is being used in this case. Also, just the sound effects of the Jedi starfighters going through there is just, it's a great, the whole scene is so good. I don't want to spend the whole show talking about that one scene, but it is such a great scene. A couple of leitmotifs I wanted to talk about briefly, that you get to hear Yoda's theme for the first time in the prequels, which is cool when he's taken off from Kashyyyk. And then I love the end, how it kind of, as it shows Leia being dropped off on Alderaan, that you hear her theme. And then, of course, the film wraps with the main title, which is also Luke's theme. And just that last scene with the transitions between the leitmotifs is just beautiful.
I mentioned earlier that every movie has its signature song. And for me, it's the one that plays during the opening, especially, of Anakin and Obi-Wan's fight. And I tried looking up the name, and as far as I know, it's just called Anakin versus Obi-Wan. Or Obi-Wan versus Anakin. It's one of the two.
Yeah, I've heard Battle of the Heroes for that one too.
Oh,
So
that sounds familiar.
I think that might be what we're talking about.
And it's just a stunning piece of music. And I think that, George Lucas did really a pretty fantastic job at setting this scene where it feels like two equals going at each other. And you have you do. We know that Obi-Wan's going to live. And we, of course, know that Anakin's going to live. But it feels like this tug of war that you're not really sure what's going to happen in the moment of it. It's just a very exciting scene. And that music, when it kicks in, after that kind of emotional moment with Padme, it's one of my favorite Star Wars moments, just made more intense by that music there.
Yeah, and then it bleeds in and out of Duel of the Fates in there too.
Yeah.
And again, we have that, it's, if you look at it as it's all Anakin's fate that's being decided through these three films. It's really cool just to hear it again at, when the stakes are that much higher.
Yeah.
And then you hear it with, Yoda's fighting Palpatine as well. Obviously the fate of the galaxy is
in the
at
balance.
stake.
Yeah.
Right. Did you have anything for vocal sounds? The big thing I had for that one was the sand people in the background, which I thought was just kind of a cool little drop where Palpatine reminds Anakin about, after he kills Dooku, it was kind of like, you remember what you told me about your mom and the sand people. It's like, it's natural to want revenge. And then you get to hear that cool little drop of, oh yeah, from the last film, this is what happened.
Yeah, it's like an echo of a memory.
Yeah, I think it's pretty effective.
The only thing that really stood out to me was Palpatine's voice change after fighting Mace. And I feel like it even changes a third time where right after, we have that transformation of Palpatine into Sidious, there's something about his voice that feels mechanical. It feels robotic to me in a way. It just feels very artificial. And, when he comes back to the Senate, he sounds more kind of like the classic Palpatine. And I'm not sure if that was intentional or if I'm mishearing it, but there's definitely a shift in his voice. And, perhaps that's kind of him playing to the politicians, where he's kind of using his reptilian voice with Vader. But that was just an interesting transition for me. And it's something I actually gave a lesson about symbolism earlier this week. And we were talking about weak and strong symbolism and how, basically anything can be a symbol because it just stands for something else. But really strong symbolism changes with the character. So you have Palpatine's voice transforming, that is symbolic of him kind of taking off the mask and revealing who he really is. And who he really is this kind of reptilian evil monster. And really, he doesn't have that much, as far as character goes, he doesn't have much like counterbalance. Like Anakin is very good / bad character, tug of war. Palpatine is pretty much just straight evil.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting. Like Vader's was seen originally as like the big bad, but then there's like, how bad would the guy have to be who's pulling Vader's strings? and you get to see that. Yeah, there is no conflict in Sheev at all. So let's go ahead and transition into performance because we kind of already touched on it a little bit. I mean, I thought that the makeup was really great for Palpatine when he fully transforms, and it's cool to see that echo of what he looked like in Return of the Jedi. And then we've had discussions about like, is that one great thing that kids have asked many times is, well, why does that happen to him when Luke gets electrocuted in Return of the Jedi? Why doesn't Luke look like that? And you can have the discussion about which is his true face, right? And obviously it's back to back to symbolism that we get to see, like he's been rotten this whole time, so we're kind of getting the full reveal of his true nature.
Yeah.
But I mean, the performances in this film, we've kind of already talked about it a little bit, but I just thought we're great all around. It's cool to see Anakin and Obi-Wan basically be like brothers in this thing, and they're very self-assured. And you're like, the Clone Wars color some of that too, that you're like, yeah, these guys have been doing this for a while. That opening scene again, when they're just destroying battle droids left and right without even breaking a sweat, and you see them fully in their prime. They're very self-assured. And even, Padme's pretty self-assured in this one too. She seems comfortable in the role. It doesn't have a huge part in this one, but I think she's very solid in what she does. She's very believable when you see her, especially when she realizes what's happening with Anakin. There's the scene where she thinks he's died that just, it feels authentic. Natalie Portman obviously is a very good actress, and so it's not surprising that she's pulling this off. But I think the direction in this film is just so much stronger than we've seen so far.
I would really tend to agree. I think that I have been a bit more down on the performances in episode 1 and 2. I think overall there's just a much higher level of performance, like you said, across the board. As far as static acting, with actors who are under emoting, I didn't have anyone written down. There might be little moments here and there, but there was nothing that really stood out to me enough where I felt like I needed to, write it down to remember it. I feel like Obi-Wan still is stealing the movie with his acting. I think Ewan McGregor is probably the most consistent person throughout the prequels. Padme does a better job, in my opinion. I will say that the love scenes felt melodramatic to me, where it was just cheesy. I would prefer that over the under emoting, the static acting that I felt, the coldness that I felt from Padme in episode 2 in the beginning of the movie, where, I think she does a better job in the love scenes. I don't think they're great. I don't think they're fantastic, but I would take cheese over nothing. And Palpatine is also fantastic, although he's so over the top, but I can't hate him. He's amazing. The best line in the movie, though, has to be from the beginning when Obi-Wan says that Sith Lords are their speciality.
I had that written down too.
Because you were talking about their self-assurance, and it's like they are nothing if not self-assured. And with good reason. I mean, for Obi-Wan, this is his at least second Sith Lord, I think, officially.
Right, yeah. If you're counting, yeah. Supposedly killed Maul, and then he's facing Dooku.
Yeah.
The great irony of that statement, of course, is that he's talking to a Sith Lord, telling him how good we are at handling Sith Lords.
Right.
Yeah, I had him down for, I had Sidious down for melodramatic too, but you can't hate him. He's clearly doing what he's supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
I also had Grievous down for that too.
Yeah.
But again, it's serving the same purpose. He is very much supposed to be the kind of one-off mustache twirling villain. Like he's not dynamic. He's very much a flat character, but he serves his purpose. He is the supposed big bad that they have to deal with. That's new to this film. Yeah, a lot of great lines in this movie. I love that Anakin says, "This is where the fun begins." That's just a cool nod to Solo from A New Hope. Obi-Wan gets the second, "I have a bad feeling about this" again. So out of the 3 films, he gets to say it twice. The thing that makes me laugh now, after Clone Wars, is Anakin saying, "My powers have doubled since the last time we met." And I'm like, what, since like last week?
Yeah.
Because they meet so many times in Clone Wars. And, it's interesting that they did a really good job in Clone Wars never having Anakin meet Grievous. So you get that moment where, he legitimately hasn't met him. And, I love that line too. He's like, "You're shorter than I expected." He's fully cocky, but deservedly so. So they did that, but it's interesting that he and Dooku have met many times. And so that line doesn't quite hold up in this case. And if you've just seen the films, yeah, that makes sense. And of course, that's original context. But the last couple I had was, Yoda's line about training yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose, and whether or not that's, legitimate. Is that something that's possible? Is the discussion point that we have in class a lot. And of course, you get this speech about Darth Plagueis. That's another classic. A couple other things I noticed, facial expression-wise, that just stood out to me is Dooku's face when Palpatine tells Anakin to kill him, where he just looks and he's just like, "What do you mean?" Like, what is happening here? He looks at him with just that shock and betrayal, which is interesting. Later, Anakin, after he kills him, has this similar look where he's kind of just confused about what he's done. Like, he's the one that did it, but you can see that he's completely conflicted at this point. But, he's all in black, so we know he's on his way. So speaking of costuming, he's Proto-Vader. And then, we talked about Sheev. And then the last thing I had was, and of course, it's a movie, and it's a mythic movie. But you know how you have Padme's clothing designed to hide her pregnancy that we're supposed to kind of buy that, she's 8 months pregnant.
With twins.
With twins. Right. With twins on the down low.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, they do a good job with like the flowing gowns and whatnot. And she's hiding behind pillars and shadows apparently. So she's going to be okay. Anything else for performance that you want to touch on before we get to the end?
I don't think so. Do you want to move to setting and design?
Yeah.
What'd you have for that?
So for me, what's always fun is that I think this is the film with the most locations. When we watch Rogue One, I may have to do a count. There's quite a few locations in Rogue One too, but tons of planets.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Especially in that montage where Order 66 happens, it's just like one scene of several films, like several planets rather, like Megiddo and Catanamoidia, where Plo Koon dies. But it's cool you get to see Kashyyyk for the first time outside of the holiday special, which, then they've used some of the that as a reference point too, which is fun. We get to see, Mustafar's great. Alderaan's beautiful. Again, almost everything's CGI in this film as well, location-wise, other than Tunisia at the end. I think that might be the only real-world location. But my favorite thing with the setting design is the observation platform and how much, at the beginning, and how much it echoes the throne room on Death Star 2. Because I remember, again, after seeing Phantom Menace, that this was going to be a rhyming thing. Okay, well, that's like the Death Star. This is like him fighting Vader on Cloud City. I'm like, there's going to be a scene that's going to be like Luke facing Vader. And to get to see that early in the film, it's like, okay, yes, this is doing everything I wanted to do. And so that was just kind of the culmination of, yes, you promised this, now I'm going to get it. And so that's just one of my favorite sets. And then I just had for prompts that the Japor snippet shows up again.
Oh, yeah, at the funeral.
It shows up at the funeral. Also, and when he starts to tell her about the dream that she's going to die. And I just thought it was kind of a cool nod to Phantom Menace, this small, insignificant thing that shows up to be pretty big. And the funeral thing is really the big thing, where it's like, even at the end, she still loves him. She still has that hope for him.
For me, with setting and design, my big thing was the juxtaposition at the end of the film when Anakin is being transformed into Darth Vader, and it cuts back and forth to Padme giving birth to Luke and Leia. I think, like that's kind of what I mean by, because, while some of that is setting design, it's also a little bit of cinematography, where I think that's the most interesting use, where, one life is ending. In a way, Vader's life is beginning, and it's setting into motion the rest of the Star Wars, the Skywalker saga. I have to say that I think it's stupid that Padme dies of a broken heart. I don't like that. And it just feels, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right to me. And I do kind of wish that Anakin had killed Padme. And I know that sounds terrible, but I feel like it makes it more tragic in a way if he is the direct cause of her death rather than a sort of indirect, which I feel dying of the broken heart is. And to me, it feels out of character, I guess, if I had to pin it down to something. Because, especially in episode 2, we see Padme as this fiery go-getter. She's going to get the job done. She's a queen. Yeah, she's a senator, but she's not afraid to get her hands dirty and do the work. And in the Clone Wars cartoon, we see even more of that side of her. And I just don't feel like dying of a broken heart is who Padme is. I could see her trusting Anakin too much and getting hurt from Anakin's anger. And that to me reads more in character to Padme than that. But I also like what they're trying to do by connecting those two through juxtaposition. The two medical rooms that they're in, it's kind of the polar opposites. It's very much the blue and the red as far as the light and the dark side, flipping back and forth between those two things.
Yeah, it's, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I had that under camera work and I forgot it. I missed it somehow, that you have that extreme high angle on that. I tend to think that there's more going on than she dies of broken heart. And I've heard that people have said that before too. It doesn't, because it actually says she's lost the will to live, right? That's what it is. And yeah, she's gone through trauma, clearly. What I like, and it's just a theory, but I think that you can probably justify it even a little bit more after Rise of Skywalker, is that what could be happening is that Palpatine is sucking her life force and putting it into Anakin. I've heard, he's influencing the midichlorians in that way, which kind of, it's set up, we talk about, can you get it from the text? Well, in the Darth Plagueis speech, they talk about manipulating the midichlorians to create life and stop death and all that stuff. And he promised it, even though he didn't, and then later recanted in a little bit. But I like that theory, that through the Force, he is being, and you have because you have the symbolism already of he's being reborn as she's dying. So, we could take it one step further and say that, he is literally taking her life force as Palpatine, taking it from Padme and putting it into Vader.
And I think this is an ambiguous part of the story. And, when ambiguity is used intentionally, I think you're meant to read into it, especially into the symbolism. And so I think because it's left ambiguous, I think it's totally valid to read that into it. Connected with the Plagueis speech and, what we learn later from Rise of Skywalker. I think that is a very possible explanation. I feel like I would have liked a little bit stronger indication that might be happening, or, a more didactic, like more explicit, yes, Sidious is doing this. He is using Anakin very much. He's killing Padme to keep his apprentice alive so that he can use him. And I think that's something that Palpatine would do. So I definitely can see that. I think on the surface, it doesn't quite get there for me, but I could see how that could make sense and could work for other people.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what our listeners have to think about that, because those are just a couple of theories. So, and I love the fact that, he said it's ambiguous, and that's great. That I like Star Wars when it's ambiguous and that you can kind of fill in your own headcanon, as it were, as long as it's not, contradicting anything else. It's just as legitimate as anything else. So, we're moving on to characters, and really the only thing I had for this one was just that, Grievous is kind of this precursor to Vader. I thought that was fun that he's a cyborg and it doesn't quite work. He's got a breathing problem as well. That's kind of fun. And we've kind of already talked about Anakin being just supremely confident. I love the scene. I keep talking about the beginning. I know, but I just love that so much. Where you have the two of them, he and Obi-Wan, approaching Grievous's ship, and they both get attacked by the droids and
the buzz droids.
Yeah. And Obi-Wan's like, no, nothing too fancy. And then Anakin's like, all right, turn off the thrusters and do a whole bunch of crazy. It's like they're complete opposites in a lot of ways. They complement each other. And if, they've done tons of these things in battles left and right. So it's really cool that they really do. They kind of fill in each other's gaps. They're such a complementary piece to each other. But that's pretty much all I had for characters. Did you have anything additionally that stuck out to you that we haven't already talked about?
I want to agree with you about that complementary relationship that they have. The main characters that we are talking about, I feel like we've kind of covered already, either in this episode or previous episodes. And I don't feel like the characters have changed that much. And one thing that stood out to me, though, and I wasn't really sure where to stick this, so I kind of had it under characters, was I feel like there are a couple tonal whiplashes, especially early in the movie. And what I mean by that is, when you're talking about tone, it's kind of, I guess in my mind, it's kind of how serious the movie is taking itself and how the director wants the movie to be portrayed. You take something like Saving Private Ryan, that's got a very serious tone. It's meant to be taken seriously. Star Wars is not meant to be taken that seriously. But I feel like you have the strong opening, which we both absolutely love because we keep talking about it. And, you have this massive battle that we've never really seen something that visually busy with just chaos. And then you have Obi-Wan and Anakin, and they're on this mission to save Palpatine. What gets me is how goofy the battle droids are. Everything up until that point, I'm fine with, and I'm running with. But for me, it doesn't feel like Anakin or Obi-Wan are in any danger at all when they're fighting the battle droids. Mm-hmm. And when, Obi-Wan's flying in his ship, and there's that one moment when his windshield ices over and he can't see, that feels chaotic and that feels intense. The later fight between those two feels intense, and it's that tug of war. But when R2-D2 is burning up the super battle droids in his oil, it's kind of like right. That it just doesn't, that feels much more of a kid's cartoon. That feels more like the Clone Wars cartoon than a slightly more serious and intense movie that they're going for. I mean, We have Anakin killing younglings in this movie, which is about tonally dark as you get in Star Wars. And then you have the silly, goofy scene of the battle droids. And I like the goofiness in the cartoon, the Clone Wars cartoon. I love the battle droids, just silliness. But it also feels like a little bit of betrayal where in episode 1 in particular, part of the reason that makes the battle droids so intimidating is that they are robots. They have no emotion. They have no connection like the clones might have. They're not people. And so if they're programmed to kill you, they will. And I just get no sense of danger from them from that moment, where I feel like the rest of the movie is trying to say, no, this is a dark film. This is kind of Empire Strikes Back level of darkness. This is not good for our heroes. That just felt really off to me.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I mean that could just be, I'm thinking of reasons. I feel like we have this push and pull, you and I, with, all right, here's the hard part, here's the thing I struggle with, and then I'm like, all right, let me show you why you're wrong and why it's okay, and I have a reason to justify it, and so I'm kind of like, is there one? And I have one. I could say that. And I could be reading into it, but that's fine. It's it's ambiguous that the droids were never really an issue, and especially not now, because all they have to do is flip a switch and turn them off. They're not really the threat that they're presented. This whole thing is a ruse, and so you're actually getting to see, these droids are not that big a deal. This is a completely contrived, manufactured threat, so you shouldn't be afraid of them. But I do see your point. I do see that they are kind of intimidating which is kind of funny. Phantom Menace is a lighter film, and yet the droids are much more imposing. There's a level of gravitas to them in the first movie that there's not in this one.
And I actually do see your point, because I think we even brought this up in our episode about episode 1, where Anakin and Obi-Wan just mow through the battle droids like nothing. They cut through them like butter. But I was thinking more specifically of the Gungan scene, where you see hundreds and thousands of them. And that's the overwhelming intimidation. One by itself is nothing, but it's because there's an army of battle droids out to kill you. I also think briefly of The Mandalorian, and I'm struggling to remember, was there a super battle droid in The Mandalorian?
Yeah, we got to see live action. Yeah.
And I feel like that was much more intimidating. That's where I feel like Star Wars as a whole, as a canon, it feels like a different tone that they take at different moments, whether the battle droids are going to be scary or intimidating or goofy. And so that's just something that stood out to me, where, rewatching these movies all in a row again, I felt more of that tonal imbalance than perhaps if I'm just watching one of them on a random Sunday afternoon.
Sure. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. But again, counterpoint. So what's interesting, I think, is the context. Context is everything, right? So you have those shots from Phantom Menace, and then those are in the trailer too. They're like, wow, this is, you see the tanks coming over and the sound and whatnot. Against Gungans, yeah, big deal. Against a small child like Din Djarin was, big deal. Against seasoned Jedi, not such a big deal. So I don't know. It's awesome. I'd love to hear again what do people think about the battle droids in the tonal shifts. Because, for the most part, it's a pretty serious film. But, R2-D2 just wasting those two super battle droids handily, and then kind of whistling away like he was never in any danger.
Yeah.
So, moving on to, I'm assuming we're ready to move on. We'll move on to the galaxy, the Force. We kind of hit on a little bit that there's the midichlorians come back in this film. They took a break in Attack of the Clones, and we hear about the ability to manipulate them. We had not heard that yet. That's new. Whether or not they can create life, transfer life force, which we do later get confirmation in both Mandalorian and Rise of Skywalker that it is possible to transfer life force from one to another. And so we talked about the theory already about how Padme dies and Anakin's reborn, at that being a possibility. But the big thing for me in this one is just seeing, and we saw it in A New Hope, but chronologically, this is the first time where you see Ben Kenobi feeling the destruction of Alderaan, and you see Yoda very viscerally feeling the deaths of Jedi all over the galaxy. You see him drop his cane. You see him putting his hand on his chest. And, that's heavy. That's heavy stuff, to be able to be that intimately tied to all those people and to have felt the deaths is a thing that is new, but it's it's heavy.
Now, do you know if we have any kind of confirmation that the Jedi as generals, do they feel the deaths of their clone troopers that they lead?
I would think there'd be stuff in Clone Wars about that, and it's been a little while since I'm due for a rewatch, but I would think they would because they're living beings, so they're connected to the Force as much as anything else, as any other regular humans would be.
So I kind of wonder, the reason I bring that up is because of what you said about, Yoda very viscerally feeling the death of all the Jedi. I wonder if the Jedi felt the deaths of all of those clone troopers during the war and like what kind of trauma that would leave on them. That kind of death and destruction on that scale. Because I forget how long, but I think someone in one of the prequel movies said that there hadn't been, an army of the Republic for 1,000 years or something like that. So, most likely the death and destruction that they're potentially could feel would be nothing on the scale of what the Clone Wars would bring.
Yeah. Because you have the clones that are essentially, built to be bred to be disposable. They're dying by the thousands. Yeah. That's the thing. I've not really heard, that's a show unto itself. Honestly, I've not really heard a lot of discussion about that, about what kind of trauma, what kind of PTSD the Jedis would be experiencing. I just use Jedis like it's plural. Jedi is the plural of Jedi. Would be experiencing having, felt all those losses. What would that do to you? We talk about losing the ability to use the Force. Maybe it's tied to that, that you become numb to it because you had to be desensitized to it.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting theory. And it just kind of popped into my head just because, we've talked quite a bit actually about how the Jedi are not what they're supposed to be. From episode 1 up to episode 3, the Jedi Order is a organization that's crumbling, just like the Republic that they're in.
Yeah, we may have to come back and revisit that because I think there's a lot there. The last couple things I had with that are I love that the Arc 170 is very much the precursor to the X-Wing. We get to see both of those in the opening battle. Let's talk about that some more. Yeah, you see like a proto X-Wing, and then, I love that the Jedi Interceptors, the new ones, are very much proto TIE fighters in the fact that they have this, they have the same kind of cockpit, and then when they open up the wings on the side, it's like, yeah, you were seeing what you thought you were seeing. It's like they're flying TIE fighters, and there's X-Wings during the prequel era. Anything else on that before we get down to Hero's Journey?
Nothing that we haven't already talked about. So yeah. I think I'm ready to move on.
Okay. So I've heard it say, and I think it was Brian Young I heard it from, that it's essentially an inverted hero's journey for Anakin in a lot of ways. And so, because it's his journey to becoming a villain, it's the villain's journey, especially in this film. It's been happening the whole time. I believe that the seeds have been there since Phantom Menace, with his attachments and those kinds of things and his inability to let go. And so what I tried to do with this one, I was like, can I see a hero's journey just in this film, but taken on the dark way? And so I do see, this is what I had. So you have the call to adventure, refusal, and acceptance is all happening at the beginning where he kills Dooku. Right? He has to choose which path he's going to take. We talked earlier about the blue and the red lightsabers, and he chooses the red path. Right? It's kind of a choose your own adventure thing at this point, because this is, and that's the beautiful thing about this thing rhyming, is that you see Luke and Jedi faced with the same choice about whether or not he kills Vader, and then Palpatine blows it by saying, yes, he's good, all this stuff. And then Luke brings himself back. Anakin doesn't bring himself back. He goes down that path. And so then we have this road of trials where essentially it's what is he going to do with the premonitions about Padme's death. He's faced with this big thing, and he almost tells Yoda, kind of does. He doesn't really tell Palpatine, but he's getting answers to his questions without asking them. And then the biggest test, I think, is what does he do between Sheev and Mace? And when, he has to choose which side, again, ultimately, which side am I going to take the Jedi path, or am I going to let Palpatine live because I think I need him? So when he makes that choice, that's essentially where he leaves the Jedi Order. That's a symbolic death to me. And so you have him become a Sith. We're starting the apotheosis. And ultimately, I think that happens, after Mustafar. He's reborn in the suit, new identity. You have the outside help of Palpatine. And then he is fully reborn as you'll get that last shot of him, or he's more machine than man. What do you think about that? Did I totally?
No, I think it's a very, very interesting reading of it. I think it's fantastic. I think especially the rebirth of Anakin as Darth Vader at the end is kind of a cool linchpin to transition from one trilogy to the next.
Well, thanks. I tried to stretch this pattern into this, because I'd heard, but I hadn't heard him explain it, and so I was like, well, maybe I can try and see if it fits the paradigm.
I also think that like the hero's journey doesn't have to be exact either.
No, totally not.
And so I think there's definitely elements of the hero's journey within it. And so I think you're on the right path of reading hero's journey into the story, even if it's missing some parts of it. I think there's enough there that I think that's a very valid reading.
So what do you think about his turn then? Or do you fall into the camp of, yeah, I can totally see this. This seems legitimate, or wow, he turned really fast. How do you feel about that? Because there's two camps out there.
I buy the reasoning that's given because I look at Shmi and I look at how Anakin feels about her and how he's tied to her in this way that breeds possessive jealousy in a way. And what I mean by that is like he's driven to revenge. So the loss of Shmi in episode 2 drives him to do something horrible. And like, that's pretty bad. And so, what does he do after that? He turns all of his attention to Padme. And when he thinks he's going to lose Padme, it makes sense that he would do something drastic to try and prevent the death of a loved one. So I totally buy that. I do think that the buildup is weak, and I do think that the turn was a little too fast. And this ties into what I feel is the weakness of this trilogy is episode 1, in the sense that it doesn't fully connect. And it doesn't, that time, we don't have as much time given to Anakin and Padme's relationship that I think we could have used. Because I think the building blocks are there, and it makes sense to me, like what he did for Anakin. And that's where like the Clone Wars cartoon comes in and fills in so much of that relationship with depth and richness. And there's a part of me that kind of wishes we had gotten that in the movie form, where the beginning of episode 2 is the beginning of our trilogy. And the middle of this trilogy is Anakin's marriage. And we get a little bit more of him and the Jedi on that warpath, because I feel like that's an aspect that affected the Jedi more than they probably let on, and Anakin in particular. What's the saying? If the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Right.
And he's, growing up, he is a general. In his prime, he is a warrior. He's not a peacekeeper. He's not a poet. He's not a meditation guru like Qui-Gon or something. He kills. He uses violence to solve his problems. And he never really gets over that possessiveness where if I can't have this, you're going to pay. That kind of revengeful quality. So I feel like the skeleton is there. I do think the actual turn is too quick. It's not bad. It's not horrible, but I do think it's too quick where he, one moment he's like, do I help Mace? Do I, help Palpatine? And then he's bowing down to him. Yeah, I'm Darth Vader. That's all done. Yeah. So I'm kind of torn on it. How about you?
Again, we just keep going back around the same. See, I buy it because I think that he reacted emotionally. He was totally, at a loss about what he's going to do. I need her. Like I need him. So I need you just to back off. He's telling Mace, I need him. And then he reacts and he does this. And I think this is the moment when, he says a few moments later, he says, now you're Lord Vader, right? He christens him. But I think that's the moment when he's Vader, when he makes that choice, when he does that. And I've heard, I think it was Kyle Newman that said this makes sense because when you see him choose to save Luke and kill Palpatine and Jedi, that's when he becomes Anakin again. And so you have that beautiful rhyming again. But what I see with this is when he allows Palpatine to kill Mace, that there's no turning back. I see resignation. I see, well, I'm down this path. There's no way back for me.
Yeah.
I put all my eggs in the Sith basket. I have to just do this now. He's gotten, the question of whether or not he actually loved Padme. I tend to think no, because I don't think he really knows what that is. I think he wanted to possess her.
Yeah.
At all costs. And so having that be that selfish, that he was just like, I'm going to make this happen. And if I have to do this, then I'll make this happen. And then he has this slippery slope of, I guess I'll go have to kill the Jedi now because they lied to me. And, Palpatine had done all this seeding of they don't really trust you. And then, there's evidence that they don't. I tend to think that he was kind of boxed into a corner and felt like he had to just proceed to do this. And if you really want to go this way, you can and say, well, the dark side had him, because there is this element, this mystical element, this, once the dark side grabs you, like it's going to dominate your destiny. And he's already let it in multiple times, with the Sand People, with Dooku earlier in this film, and that he's just he's locked in. He may not have full control over what he's doing.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of a figurative interpretation. It's not a literal interpretation of what's happening. But that's kind of where I look at him just going, well, this is the choice I made. I have to live with it now.
Yeah. And I guess I could probably more accurately say that I feel that the payoff was all right, but the setup could have been stronger. There was setup. I just felt like it could have been better. It could have been a stronger setup. The one scene that I always come back to is the Clone Wars episode with Clovis and how possessive Anakin is when it seems like Padme may be attracted to Clovis or there may be something there between them. And that scene right there really shows to me that what Anakin is experiencing is possessiveness, kind of like what you said, and not love. And that leads me to buy into, I feel like that's really good setup for his eventual turn.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if it had been possible for us to have seen episode 2, all of Clone Wars, and then Revenge of the Sith, how would your impressions be? Would it? Well, yeah, that just makes sense.
I think it would. I think it'd be better.
Yeah. That's the thing. So when you have kids, make them do that. Make them wait. Can we watch the next film? No, we have 7 seasons of Clone Wars. And if you give me any back talk, you're going to watch the Gendy micro series too. Read this comic book. Go. And all the novels in between. Yeah, just for context.
For context. Yeah. So, if you're ready to move on, I kind of wonder what your final thoughts are on the movie in the wider Star Wars canon, and also because we're at the end of our first trilogy, how the Revenge of the Sith and the whole trilogy kind of feels as a whole unit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love this film. This is one of my favorite Star Wars films. I like Empire, and I like Jedi is actually my favorite film. But I remember when this first came out, I was kind of blown away by how much I really liked this film, because I'm a Star Wars fan, so I enjoyed Phantom Menace and I enjoyed Attack of the Clones. But this was like, wow, this is a whole other level. With the way that we talked a little bit about how it leads right up into the original trilogy, it dovetails so nicely that you don't need anything else in the middle. The performances being what they are, the battle scenes, it's getting to see pretty much we got everything in this film you could possibly want that the prequels had promised, right? I mean, it was 16 years in between. We've been hearing, yeah, maybe we're going to get this new Star Wars film. Maybe we're going to get the prequels eventually. This is the film that people wanted. This is the centerpiece of the prequels. And, I've heard it said that this is the one that Lucas kind of had this one kind of locked and loaded, and the other ones were kind of broad strokes that he filled in. And I think we've kind of talked a little bit about that and how, those kind of suffer from that. But again, people want Vader. People love Vader. That's what they want. So, I still think it's a great film. I think visually it's amazing. I think it has some of the best music. It has definitely some of the best cinematography of all of the Star Wars films. The fight scene at the end, that's another thing. The duel, capital T, capital D, between he and Obi-Wan. And yeah, this is just a film. I would watch this film by itself, out of context. Usually I watch a Star Wars film like start at the beginning, gonna plow through, but this is one I would just put on just to watch because I enjoy it so much. What about you?
Yeah, I think that this is the crown jewel of the prequels. As much as I've been criticizing this movie, I do think it is the best of the prequel films. Narratively, performance-wise, cinematography, I think Episode 1 has more background and lore as far as the galaxy, because, that's one of the aspects that we look at. I feel like there's more in Episode 1 in terms of that, but it's all kind of used in Episode 3. Midichlorians, you have some interesting world building on top of that. Overall, this is usually, my rankings of Star Wars film change probably every time you ask me, but this is usually up there. I wouldn't say probably top 3, but it's in my top half. And I'll have to wait and see, what it is this next time, because I think we're going to do a ranking episode at some point after we've watched them all.
That's an idea.
And
yeah.
I always feel that like my opinions change after watching all of the movies in a row in like short order, because you have more context of seeing them all, kind of stacked next to each other. So overall, I enjoyed it a lot more than Episode 1 or Episode 2. It'll be really interesting, I think, taking a look at the prequels as a whole compared to the sequels, because those are a lot more controversial. And I think that there's some interesting contrast between the two and how they work together and how they fit with everything that's going on. And that's kind of the fun of doing, talking about these movies like this, because there are so many interconnecting threads that I'm kind of anxious to get to those movies so we can talk about what happened in these movies, right, and how the threads get tied later on.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we talked about the fact that there were broad strokes for, the original, for the prequel trilogy. We kind of knew where the story was going to go,
right?
As opposed to the sequel trilogy, which we know was being created kind of like building an airplane while they're flying it, right? So
yeah,
and we talk about tonal shifts and the weaknesses and strengths of that as well. When we get there, that'll be a good discussion down the road. Any other final thoughts on Revenge of the Sith? Best title of the prequel trilogy.
Yeah,
it's, and again, the rhyming with Return of the Jedi and the whole Revenge of the Jedi thing, which we'll get to. Yeah, I mean, this was one, I think this is just the one that delivered, from the beginning. The first couple of prequel films was like, okay, that's what they're calling it. Okay, what's it going to be about? This was like, yep, okay, this is it. Yeah, this is the one you're waiting for. Here's the battle scene from the beginning. Again, we're talking about that. But, it's like, there's, I don't know, it has everything that you'd want. There might be some things that you didn't as well, but I think it packs in everything. It packs in the twins, for crying out loud. It packs in the Death Star briefly at the end. Other than a little orphan Han Solo, which was at one point, going to show up in there. It's got everything to set up the original trilogy that you could possibly want. I mean, even Chewie's in this. We didn't even talk about that. Chewie's in this.
Yeah.
So
a little cameo.
Yeah.
So as we close, we just want to say thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on X and Facebook. Email us at readingbetweenreels@gmail.com or use the SpeakPipe app on our website. And if you enjoyed the show, please tell a friend and support us by writing a review on your favorite podcast catcher. Our regular episodes drop every other Wednesday, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the fun.